Hello and welcome to the Case for Baseball Hall of Fame podcast. I'm your host, attorney and baseball fan extraordinaire Russell Christian. On each episode of this podcast, we examine a different Major League Baseball player's career, and I'll make the case for whether I believe this player does or does not deserve enshrinement in the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum in Cooperstown, New York. If you're one of the many people who took to social media this past weekend to share your opinion that Nolan Ryan punching Robin Ventura or Odor clocking Jose Bautista were both better fights to watch than Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson, then this is definitely the podcast for you. A friendly reminder, I've never played professional baseball. I'm just a fan. I'm also an attorney. And believe me when I say it is way more fun to debate the pros and cons of a player's hall-worthiness than it is to see the look of disappointment on my friends' faces when I have to break the news to them that the Nevada Gaming Commission rule cited by George Clooney in Ocean's 11, mandating that a casino must hold in reserve enough cash to cover every chip and play on its floor, and thus, by law, on a fight night, must keep at least $150 million cash on hand in their vaults, is a fictitious statute. Sorry, guys, if anyone out there is planning on robbing the Bellagio, they don't have that money in the vault. Sorry, it's fictitious. Great movie, though. Before we get started, today's Superfan shout-out goes to Brian O'Leary, at Brian D. O'Leary on Twitter X. Brian follows me and always has insightful comments to make about baseball on my Twitter X account, which you can follow at The Case For. So, Brian, thanks for listening. Thanks for interacting and sharing your thoughts. Look forward to more conversations with you about baseball in the future. The subject of our 16th episode is Richard Allen, a.k.a. Dick Allen, a perennial fan favorite and one of the players who just seems to make every diehard fan's short list of glaring Hall of Fame omissions. Dick Allen is up for consideration on this year's Classic Baseball Era Committee ballot. Now, as you know, I make the case for each player's induction in three parts: statistics, hardware, and the fame factor. And with statistics, I like to look at traditional as well as some of the advanced or sabermetric statutes. I also, typically in my episodes, like to give a little biography of each player. I'm going to do that with Dick Allen here, but I also want to say just the story of Dick Allen is so rich, nuanced, and details that I just don't have time to get into all the details. I mean, the biography I'm going to read is already pretty long, but Dick Allen's life story is just very interesting. I'll say, if each prior episode's biography section was, a standalone movie, Dick Allen's origin story would be a 5-season Netflix series with, 10 one-hour episodes each season. There's just a lot to get into with Dick Allen's life and his career that, candidly, I will say there's just so many other people that have done a better job diving into Dick Allen's biography and life story, way better than I'm able to for this episode of this podcast. So for that reason, I want to take a moment, as I like to do, I like to mention books I've read in preparation for this. I want to give you sort of a reading list. I don't want to call it homework, but if you're really interested about Dick Allen, if you like this episode and you want to read more about Dick Allen, here's some books and some documentaries I highly recommend. I want to read these off here. First is a book called God Almighty Himself, The Life and Legacy of Dick Allen by Mitchell Nathanson. Another is Dick Allen, The Life and Times of a Baseball Immortal, an illustrated biography by William C. Cachadas, I hope I pronounced that correctly. And it includes a great foreword by Hall of Famer Mike Schmidt, who actually was teammates with Dick Allen for a brief period. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Another great book is Chili Dog MVP by David Fletcher, John Owens, and George Castle. And of course, Crash, The Life and Times of Dick Allen by Dick Allen himself, along with Tim Whitaker. Now, if you're out there thinking, I don't have time to read books, it seems like a lot of work, there's also some other great podcasts. Sometimes people don't like to discuss the competition. I do this for fun. I don't make any money from this. It's just a labor of love. So I don't mind sharing and repping, other podcasts. There are other podcasts out there that talk about the Hall of Fame. There's YouTube videos out there about Dick Allen's life, which I highly recommend. And there's also a really great 2018 documentary entitled A Long Way From Home, The Untold Story of Baseball's Desegregation. It's currently streaming on Apple TV and Prime, and it really does a good job of condensing, as I'm trying to do today, the story of Dick Allen and other Black and Latino players who broke into Major League Baseball in the 50s and 60s, the period just after Jackie Robinson first broke the color barrier in the league. It's a great documentary, and it's only about an hour long. I really recommend it. You can watch it in lunchtime. If you work from home like me, just sit down and make your lunch, watch it. It's a really really, really good documentary, only about an hour long, I think maybe even less than an hour. So great documentary. I would definitely recommend any of those books in that documentary for fans of baseball and Dick Allen in particular. And as I said, there's just so much to get into. His life story is so long. So my bio here, which is going to be probably longer than some of my other episodes, it's still kind of like the teaser trailer or the sizzle reel, for that 5-season miniseries metaphor I was talking about earlier. But anyway, we have a lot to get into. So without further ado, let's make the case for Dick Allen. Dick Allen was born in 1942 in Wampum, Pennsylvania, a small town about 30 miles northwest of Pittsburgh. He was raised in Chewton, a small town of under 500 people just outside of Wampum. Allen was one of 9 children and grew up idolizing Jackie Robinson and loving the Dodgers. Just like another player whom we've discussed on this podcast, Dave Parker, Allen also loved baseball, loved it so much as a kid, but he didn't have the equipment to play, so he started out hitting rocks instead of baseball. As recounted in his Saber biography, his mother, Ira, recalled, "I was always paying for new window panes all over the neighborhood. The neighbors wouldn't even bother to ask the kids who was responsible. They would just come over to tell me it was Dickie again. I knew they were right too because there was no baseball fields in all of Chewton or Wampum that could hold a stone if Dickie hit it good." So as a kid, great talent, but hitting rocks, and we talked about that in the Dave Parker episode. So anyway, like many other players we've discussed, Allen was a standout high school athlete in multiple sports and was even named an All-American in basketball, along with 2 of his older brothers, Hank and Ronnie, who played with Dick on the Wampum High School basketball team, which Allen led to 2 different Division B state championships in 1958 and 1960. But early on, despite his athleticism and his prowess in multiple sports, Allen decided he was going to focus on playing baseball because he knew it paid better than basketball, and Allen really wanted to use the money to buy a new house for his mother. Luckily for Allen and his mother, Allen was equally as good, if not better, at baseball, and is generally the case for standout high school athletes in small towns. A word of his athleticism on the baseball field soon got around, earning him just one of the great all-time sports nicknames, the Wampum Walloper. Great nickname. Allen eventually caught the eye of Philadelphia Phillies scout John Ogden, himself a former Major League Baseball player who had actually played against Babe Ruth, and he once told a reporter for the Philadelphia Bulletin that, quote, Allen was the only player he ever saw who hit a ball as hard as Ruth. Wow, that's quite the compliment. Based upon the glowing recommendations of John Ogden, the Phillies ended up signing Dick Allen out of high school for $70,000. And, of course, the first thing Allen did with that money was buy his mother the house that he always wanted to. So good for Allen. Thank you for taking care of your mother. And if you're listening to this podcast, don't forget, hey, call your mother, tell her you love her. Now, I mentioned earlier the excellent documentary, A Long Way From Home, The Untold Story of Baseball's Desegregation, and that's a good place to start to get an understanding of Allen's introduction into the world of Major League Baseball. One story mentioned in the documentary and discussed in detail in the books about Allen, and really is just a big part of Allen's lore, is the famous 42-ounce bat. Allen discusses this in the documentary, and there's a lot written about it, but the short version is when he got signed by the Phillies, they gave him some bats, and when he looked at them, they were 42 ounces, which, if you don't know, that is super heavy. For comparison's sakes, most Major League players use somewhere around a 31 to 34-ounce bat, but they shipped him a 42-ounce bat, and the short version is when he started to say something, they basically said, hey, shut up, kid, use the bats we gave you. So he had to learn how to bat with a 42-ounce bat, which is very heavy. Now, just as an aside, they say that football is a game of inches. If football is a game of inches, baseball is a game of millimeters and nanoseconds. You know what I mean? Sometimes just the smallest variation of where the ball is thrown or where it hits the bat can make all the difference between a home run and a strikeout and a foul ball. And so to have even an extra few ounces on a bat, can make a huge difference. And a lot of players like to use a lighter bat for the obvious reasons that, bat speed is very important. Just, doesn't really matter how hard you hit the ball sometimes. You just got to hit the ball. You got to make contact. And you want to get around. You want to hit that ball with fast bat speed. So a 42-ounce bat, if you're swinging a huge piece of lumber, it's harder to get it around. and it's harder to hit the ball. So it's easier to hit the ball with a lighter bat. So Dick Allen had to use this 42-ounce bat, which took him a while, but once he figured it out, he was able to wield that 42-ounce bat. And that was kind of part of the story of Dick Allen. But anyway, not only was Dick Allen a teenage kid just out of high school getting signed into the tumultuous world of professional sports, but you can't mention the story of Dick Allen without mentioning, this was 1960. He joins the Phillies organization. Formal racial segregation was still in effect in parts of the country, and the Philadelphia Phillies organization had a bad reputation in that department. Now, I'm not trying to pick on the Phillies in particular, but for the purposes of the story, we have to discuss this. The Phillies organization didn't really exactly have a stellar reputation in the race relations department. If you've ever seen the movie 42, starring the late great Chadwick Boseman, you probably remember the Phillies, and in particular their manager Ben Chapman. They were the bad guys in that movie. They were the antagonists of the film, and the antagonists in this particular chapter of baseball history. Now, Chapman was fired back in 1948, and partially because of the way he was treating Jackie Robinson. But still, this was only 12 years before Allen broke into the majors. And in fact, the Phillies were the last team in the National League to include black players in the roster. So, a little trivia here for you. First black player to play for the Phillies was actually shortstop John Kennedy in 1957. He only played in 5 games for the Phillies that year, but it was only 3 years before Allen broke in with the franchise. And another thing that really was part of the story of Dick Allen, grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania. It's hard enough to be a teenage kid, far away from home, trying to break it in the big leagues. But in 1963, Allen was playing for the Phillies AAA affiliate, the Arkansas Travelers in Little Rock, Arkansas. Now, for those of you who paid attention in history class or history buffs out there, this is 1963. It's only 6 years after the Little Rock Nine first integrated Little Rock Central High School. If you recall that episode, you've probably seen the pictures. You probably remember them from your history class, your history textbook. President Eisenhower actually had to send the 101st Airborne in there to keep the peace. So, it was only 6 years after that. So it was a difficult situation for Allen. He was a bit of a pioneer that 1963 season on AAA Arkansas. It was actually the first season the Travelers racially integrated their team. And from the first game of the season, Allen faced racial taunts and all kinds of disrespect, which, some of the books I mentioned earlier go into detail. I'm not going to get into detail here in the podcast, other than to say that obviously he faced a lot of adversity that season. So needless to say, it was not a good environment for anyone, especially a young and budding athlete, and it took its toll on Allen. But despite all of these challenges, Allen managed to get voted the most valuable player of the Travelers that year, hitting .289 and leading the International League with 33 home runs and 97 RBI. He'd eventually make his major league debut on September 3rd, 1963, against the Milwaukee Braves, going 1 for 3 with a double. Allen ended up having just a 10-game cup of coffee that 1963 season, but in those 10 games, he had 7 hits, 6 runs, 2 doubles, a triple, and 2 RBI, so he certainly showed a lot of promise. But before that 1964 season, 2 things happened that, again, we can dedicate an entire episode to, but I'll just briefly recap the details, as these 2 incidents are crucial to the story of Dick Allen. Now, in my last episode, I introduced him as Richard Allen. That's, of course, his full name, Richard Allen. Although he went by Dick Allen, Dick is sort of the nickname of the name Richard, as you know. As we heard earlier, his mom called him Dickie. And look, hey, mom gets to call her son whatever she wants to. That's the mother's prerogative. But otherwise, he preferred to be called Dick. But the Philadelphia Phillies insisted on calling him Richie, and the Philadelphia press followed suit. This would be a sore point of contention for his entire career in Philadelphia. And there was a quote from Allen where he said, "To be truthful with you, I'd like to be called Dick. I don't know how the Richie started. My name is Richard, and they called me Dick in the minor leagues." And he added, "It makes me sound like I'm 10 years old. I'm 22. Anyone who knows me well calls me Dick. I don't know why. As soon as I put a uniform on, it's Richie." So, needless to say, he was not happy with the fact that the team and the press were calling him Richie. So There's a lot that's been written out there. Again, I mentioned several books because there's so many good stories, and I can't get into them all right now. I recommend you reading them. But anyway, long story short, told everyone his name was Dick Allen, and the Philadelphia team and the press called him Richie, and he didn't like it. So the second big event before the 1964 season that really impacted his career, probably not in a good way, is that Phillies manager Gene Mauch decided to play Allen at third base. Now, we saw this in the Dave Parker story, how they tried Parker at different positions. Parker was actually a catcher in high school. He showed up to his first spring training, and they're like, yeah, you're not a catcher. It's not necessarily uncommon in baseball and football for players, once they hit the pros to switch positions. But nowadays, a lot of players, they'll try them out in the minors. They'll give them sort of a test run. But back then, in Allen's case, they just put him at third in 1964 and just said, hey, let her rip. He played all 162 games his rookie season at third base. And, third base is hard. There's a funny scene in the movie Moneyball when, Brad Pitt sits there and says, first base is easy, tell him Wash. And the actor playing, Ron Washington says, it's incredibly hard. Any position in baseball or professional sports is incredibly difficult, and there's a learning curve. But they just put Allen at third base, said, hey, play every game, and he ended up leading the National League in errors with 41, one of the highest error totals at that position in the modern era. In fact, since 1964, only one player has had more errors in a season than at third base, and that's Butch Hobson, who had 43 errors in 1978 at the hot corner. Now, in Allen's defense, I do want to say there's a story I love telling. It's just a good, sort of motivational speech, and I tell it now to sort of, defend Allen a little bit. Derek Jeter, of course, one of the greatest players of all time, certainly one of the greatest, defensive shortstops of all time. It's a famous story. If you know, you know. He once committed 56 errors in a season in the minor leagues, and in so doing, according to legend, he set the all-time Southeastern League record in errors. He's had gone on record, he had interviews about this, and that season he said he was just miserable. He was calling his parents, he wanted to quit, and they talked him through, and so, there's an adjustment period going to professional sports, and in Jeter's case, he adjusted, the rest is history, but, the fact is, Jeter made his mistakes and honed his craft in the minors. And that just shows the difference between what Jeter and other players have to go through or go through now as opposed to what Allen went through then. So I say all this in terms of Allen's errors and his struggles at third base that year. Again, not to pick on Allen, just show that times were different back then. And Allen, when he was just thrown into the fire, defensively speaking. So keep this all in your, I'd say this too, just keep this in your mind when you're looking at analytical stats, advanced statistics. A lot of those kind of take into account defensive metrics. And Allen, like I said, was just thrown into the fire. And he figured it out, but it took some time. So luckily for Allen, he didn't have any issues at the plate his first full season in the big leagues. And to say he had a good rookie year or a breakout season, as I like to say, just really doesn't do justice to Dick Allen's 1964 season. In 1964, Dick Allen had one of the two best seasons of his career, the other being, we'll get into it, his MVP campaign of 1972. But depending on your point of view, whether old school stats or modern analytics, there's an interesting debate here as to whether Allen's rookie season of 1964 was in fact his best season. You could make that argument, but regardless, that's conversation for another time and place. It's clear that Allen's 1964 season was certainly one of the best rookie campaigns in baseball history and one of the best seasons of his career. He played in all 162 games for the Phillies that year, and he led all of Major League Baseball in runs with 125 and triples with 13. He led the National League in total bases with 352 and collected 201 hits, the only season in his career he would have over 200 hits in a season. He also had 38 doubles, 29 home runs, and 91 RBI to go along with a slash line of 318, 382, and 557 for a 939 OPS. Man, I gotta say, that 318 batting average, in an era when batting average was the benchmark stat for players, it's just pretty amazing considering it was his first full season, and it was the fourth best in the NL that year behind Clemente, Aaron, and Joe Torre. The 557 slugging percentage that year was the third best in the NL, and interestingly, he also led the National League in strikeouts that year with 138. Pretty high total, which honestly again makes the 318 batting average all the more impressive. In terms of advanced statistics that season, Allen's 8.8 WAR, wins above replacement in 1964, was the third best in baseball that year for position players behind Hall of Famers Willie Mays and Ron Santo. He finished second in Major League in offensive WAR behind Willie Mays and sixth in adjusted OPS+. He also finished third in MLB in CWPA, or championship wins probability added. It's one of those highfalutin advanced statistics I like to talk about. So, needless to say, Dick Allen's 1964 rookie season was just an absolutely monster season and one of the best of his career. I would put it in his three best seasons along with 1966 and 1972. And for the sake of argument, we'll just say you could have a great barroom baseball conversation for hours as to which one of those three were the best. But it's fair to say Allen's 1964 rookie season was so good that, in fact, a 2023 article on MajorLeagueBaseball.com ranked it the 10th best rookie season in MLB history. I'll put that link up on my Twitter X. It's a great read. I won't spoil it as to what the number one was. You can go read it, but it's a great article. Anyway, Allen's accomplishments that 1964 season were rewarded when he won the National League Rookie of the Year award and finished 7th in the MVP voting. Now, this was the year that Ken Boyer of the World Series winning St. Louis Cardinals won the MVP, leading the National League in RBI with 119. I mention this because, of course, Ken Boyer is also on the same ballot this year with Allen, the Classic Baseball Era Committee. Ken has his own very strong Hall of Fame case this year. So, needless to say, this year's Classic Baseball Era Committee ballot is just a stacked ballot, very crowded field. It's got Dave Parker on it. I had an episode 2 episodes ago about Dave Parker. So, there's a lot of great players on there. So, I'm very excited. I know baseball fans are very excited to see what happens with the voting results on that ballot. So, interestingly, despite an incredible statistical season in 1964, a Rookie of the Year award, and a 7th place finish in the MVP vote, Allen didn't make the National League All-Star team in 1964. Now, it's the third straight episode where we've mentioned a player who had an incredible season, won some hardware, but was not voted onto the All-Star team. The other ones being Dave Parker and Felix Hernandez. If you recall my episodes, they had monster seasons, but weren't voted to the All-Star team. I mention all of this because, as I've said before, I know that from reading quotes and articles from sports writers, there are a lot of Hall of Fame voters out there for whatever reason, they put a lot of stock into how many All-Star selections a player has. So that's why I mentioned, hey, he could have easily been an All-Star that year, but he wasn't. So I think it's, All-Star votes are a compelling part of a player's legacy, as well as MVP and Cy Young votes. But, obviously, all of that has a subjective component to it. So I just mentioned all this, I don't put as much weight into All-Star selections as some voters do. But if you are someone that puts a lot of weight into All-Star selections, I always like to mention that, hey, there's a, season here, season there, where the guy should have been or could have been an All-Star. So if you're going to start counting All-Star seasons, you should kind of look at those seasons as well. So anyway, after 1964, Allen would play 5 more full seasons with the Phillies. And during that span, he'd average 30 home runs, 90 RBI, and a .296 batting average, along with a 5.3 WAR, or wins above replacement, each season. And FYI, those numbers are on Baseball Reference based upon his actual games played. Those numbers actually go up a little bit in terms of the average if you average them across 162 games. But either way you slice it, Allen was just in the zone, as we say in sports, those seasons, and just playing outstanding baseball. The word got around quick, and despite not being voted into the All-Star game in 1964, Allen did make the NL All-Star team in 1965, 66, and 67. He also got MVP votes each of those seasons, including a 4th place finish in 1966, another monster season in which he led the National League in slugging percentage with .632. It was the highest single season slugging percentage of Allen's career. To go along with 40 home runs, also the highest of his career, and the second highest in the National League that year, just 4 behind the great Hank Aaron. Allen also hit .317 that year, 3rd best in the National League, and had a .396 on-base percentage, second best in the National League, and had a .331 total bases. So great season for Allen. Although it wasn't tracked at the time, Allen also did extremely well that 1966 season in terms of the advanced statistics, leading the National League in OPS, OPS Plus, and ROBA, also known as reference weighted on-base average. RBAT Plus, which Baseball Reference describes as, quote, the hitting component of WAR, but indexed to the player's environment. So did well in some of the advanced statistics, which again weren't really known at the time, but nowadays as we look back, we see the advanced statistics, and he did very well. So 1967 was another strong season for Allen. He led the National League in on-base percentage, OPS, and OPS Plus. 1967 also marked Allen's fourth consecutive season batting over 300. If you don't include that 10-game cup of coffee in 1963, Allen's first 4 full seasons in Major League Baseball had batted over 300, which is outstanding. The batting average would dip a little bit in 1968 and 69, although he still had great power, hitting 33 and 32 home runs in those seasons, respectively. Again, I won't really get into detail here, but the short story was that during Allen's last few seasons in the Phillies, just a lot of tension between Allen, the Phillies, and the Phillies fans, and he would often get booed by Phillies fans. To make matters worse, Allen injured his hand in August of 1967, and he was working on his car, and it required surgery to heal a nerve and a tendon. So he had some surgery issues and some injury issues. During Allen's time with the Phillies, 2 other interesting and noteworthy events occurred that are really important to the story of Dick Allen. And again, I'm just going to briefly mention them here and, recommend you take a deep dive if you're interested into some of the books and the documentary I've previously mentioned and really get the full story. So first thing is, sadly, Allen began wearing a batting helmet in the dugout because fans used to throw things at him, which is just absolutely terrible. If you look at pictures of Allen throughout his career, he always had that batting helmet on in the field and in the dugout. And at one point, his teammate, legendary baseball announcer and comedian Bob Uecker, ended up giving him the nickname Crash, joking that it looked like he was wearing a crash helmet. And the nickname kind of stuck. They called him Crash Allen. Another interesting off-the-field story, which I found very interesting, is that Allen, this is fascinating, he was a musician and a very good singer. And in 1968, he started a singing group called the Ebonistics, and their song Echoes of November became a hit on the Philadelphia radio. If you go on YouTube, you can find the song. It's a really good song. The group actually sang during the halftime of a 1969 Philadelphia 76ers game. There's a great line from that song. Again, go on YouTube. It's not on Spotify, but it's on YouTube. There's a great line from that song. It's, quote, "I'll do what I have to do to spend my life with you." I thought not only is that just a good line, from a song, I also thought it was kind of a good line to sort of almost sum up the career and life of Dick Allen. As we've seen, he's overcome a lot of adversity to play the sport he loves. I'll do what I have to do to spend my life with you. Is he talking about a lover? Is he talking about baseball? Is he talking about both? So I thought that was a good line. It's a good song. Go give it a spin if you haven't listened to it. It's a really good song. So anyway, that's just a cool Dick Allen story. There's not a lot of musicians out there. There's not a lot of baseball player musicians out there. So I always have to mention, I play guitar, I like music, so I thought that was really cool, had to mention it. Off the top of my head, a couple other athletes come to mind. Bernie Williams, was a famous kind of a jazz guitar player. Another great, we could do a whole episode about this guy, he's not in the Baseball Hall of Fame, but Charlie Pride played minor league baseball, and then eventually, as the story goes, wrote songs and played on the bus and stuff. And people say, "Hey, you're kind of better at that country music thing than baseball." So I always love it when I love baseball. I'm a baseball nerd. I'm also a music nerd, so I love it when players kind of walk in both worlds. I like to walk in both worlds. So anyway, had to mention that. That's a really cool story. And I had mentioned too on one of my prior podcast episodes, Joe West, the famous umpire who was up for consideration for the Hall of Fame. He's a musician too and a songwriter. I think I mentioned he had some songs, and songs about baseball and stuff. So this is kind of a cool side note about Dick Allen. Anyway, but to briefly recap those last few years with the Phillies, they were tough ones for Allen, who not only was battling injuries, but also battling these Philadelphia sports fans who booed him and threw things at him. And again, I'll just mention it briefly here. You can write a whole book. I could do whole podcast episodes about the facts and circumstances, that led to the trade. But suffice to say, in the summer of 1969, Allen approached the Phillies saying he wanted to be traded. And in what can arguably be considered the most famous trade in baseball history, certainly the most impactful and important trade, in October of 1969, Allen and several other players were traded to the St. Louis Cardinals in exchange for several other players, including legendary baseball announcer Tim McCarver, but most notably, St. Louis's star center fielder Curt Flood. If you're at all familiar with baseball history or legal history, you surely recognize that name and probably know the story of Curt Flood. If not, that's, of course, its own separate story that has been told by many others. That's its own, 5-season, 10-episode mini series on Netflix. The short version is that Curt Flood, if you're unaware, having heard stories about Allen and other players who, experienced difficulties in Philadelphia, just basically flat out refused to play there, saying, I'm not playing Philadelphia. And he took to the courts to challenge the trade and baseball's reserve clause. And it was this reaction, Flood's response to this trade, that has created now the modern free agency system in baseball. The case went to the Supreme Court. It's a whole thing. I'll do an episode about Curt Flood. It's a fascinating story, and there's a lot of legality. So, I am an attorney. I will get into some of that stuff. It's a fascinating story. Curt Flood, of course, has his own compelling Hall of Fame case, not just as a player. He's a very good player, but also probably more importantly for his role in changing the business of baseball as we know it and creating modern free agency. So I mentioned that just to say that's kind of an interesting historical footnote that Dick Allen was involved in that Curt Flood trade. Arguably the most famous, probably the two most famous trades in baseball are Babe Ruth going from the Red Sox to the Yankees and the Curt Flood trade. And I would argue that, the curse of the Bambino and Ruth and all that stuff is probably more well-known and famous. In terms of the day-to-day aspects of baseball, the Curt Flood trade was more impactful because, as I said, it created the modern free agency system. It literally changed the face of baseball as we know it. And Curt Flood, again, we'll do an episode on him. He has his own compelling Hall of Fame case for changing the game. Anyway, Allen would only play a year in the Cardinals, but it was a good one for Allen. First and foremost, he was welcomed with open arms by Cardinals fans who recognized his talent and cheered for him. So this was a welcome change from the Philadelphia fans. And Allen would make the All-Star team in 1970 and hit 34 home runs with 101 RBI. But unfortunately for Allen, he injured his hamstring late in the season, and the Cardinals, having some concerns about whether or not he would recover and how the injury would impact him, ended up trading him after the season to the Los Angeles Dodgers, which actually made Dick Allen ecstatic. As you remember from my beginning, grew up idolizing Jackie Robinson, loved the Dodgers. So he'd been a Dodgers fan ever since he was a kid, and just getting traded to the Dodgers was very special to Allen. And he had a great season in 1971, batted .295, 23 home runs and 90 RBI. Fortunately, even though Allen added his potent bat to the Dodgers offense, they still finished second place, one game. Gosh, only one game behind their division rivals, the San Francisco Giants. And this is back before the expanded postseason and everything like that. If you didn't win your division, that was it. So because of that, the business of baseball proceeded that offseason, and Allen was again traded, this time to the Chicago White Sox. Now, this is really one of the key moments in Allen's life and baseball career. At this point, he'd been in the league 9 years. He put up great numbers. He'd made all-star teams, but he'd also been traded 3 times in 3 years. So he's getting a little sick of this. Luckily, though, for Allen, his new manager in the White Sox was Chuck Tanner. Actually grew up not far from Allen's hometown of Wampum, Pennsylvania, and actually been a lifetime friend of Dick Allen and his family. In fact, in his Sabre autobiography, there's a great moment that describes a call Allen had with his mom, where she said, "Listen, son, go help Chuck out." So Allen took his mother's advice and went to Chicago to help the White Sox. And when he arrived in Chicago, he decided first and foremost he wanted to fix something that had been bothering him most of his career. We talked about it earlier. He announced at spring training to the Chicago sports writers that he was tired of being called Richie, and he asked them to call him Dick Allen. Now, the Chicago sports writers obliged, and soon the national media followed. Now, the issue of his name now being finally resolved, Allen went about the business of having an absolute all-time great monster season, arguably the best one of his career. It's either 72 or his rookie year, 64. In 1972, Allen led the American League in home runs, RBI, walks, on-base percentage, slugging percentage, OPS, OPS plus, ROBA, RBAT plus, wins above replacement, and his .308 batting average was 4th best in the American League. As a result, he cruised to his first and only Most Valuable Player award that year, finishing with 90% of all the first place votes, just 3 votes short of a unanimous MVP. He also made his first American League All-Star appearance, but unfortunately, just as in Los Angeles, despite Allen's prodigious season, the White Sox still finished second place in the American League West, behind eventual world champions, the Oakland Athletics. Allen ended up only playing for the White Sox for 3 seasons, which is interesting considering it's his tenure with the White Sox that most people remember him for, and especially fans of my generation or younger who are really too young to have seen him play, all they really know about Allen from stories and pictures is, his time in the White Sox. And Allen actually mentioned, in his lifetime, he's passed away now, but he mentioned during his lifetime that if he had gotten into the Hall of Fame, he had wanted to go in with a White Sox cap. During those 3 seasons with the White Sox, Allen made the American League All-Star team every year and received MVP votes every year, of course, winning the MVP in 1972. His last season with the White Sox in 1974 saw him again leading the American League in home runs, slugging percentage, and ROBA. Now, unfortunately, despite Allen's excellent playing, the White Sox just couldn't win, and they never finished higher than second place during Allen's 3 years on the team. To make matters worse, Allen sustained a really terrible leg injury in 1973. He actually fractured his right leg during a first-place collision with Angels' Dick Epstein, causing him to miss over a month in the 1973 season. Then, at the end of the 1974 season, despite leading the league in home runs, Allen was plagued with shoulder and back injuries that hurt him so bad, he actually called a team meeting on September 14th, 1974, and he announced his retirement from baseball. But like so many other aspects of the Dick Allen story, there's just a long and complicated follow-up backstory involving Allen's announcement of his retirement and the business of baseball. Again, fascinating life story. The short version is that in May of 1975, despite calling a press conference to announce his retirement, Allen ended up returning back to the Philadelphia Phillies again, this time to a very welcoming fan base that, according to accounts at the time, were happy to have their aging former superstar come back home to finish his career and mentor a new generation of players. Allen would spend 2 more years with the Phillies in 1975 and 76, but he never again put up the numbers that he had in his prime and was constantly plagued by injuries. I say in every episode, Father Time comes for us all. Nevertheless, 1976 saw the Phillies winning the National League East for Allen's one and only postseason appearance of his career. Fortunately, this was not prime Dick Allen, but the aging superstar. And he only had 2 hits and 12 plate appearances in the 1976 NLCS. And he also had a crucial error in Game 2 that cost the Phillies 2 runs. The Phillies would eventually be swept in 3 games by the Cincinnati Reds. This is, of course, during their Big Red Machine era. And after the 1976, Allen was eventually released by the Phillies. He played one more final season in 1977. He only played 54 games for the Oakland Athletics. But he famously wore a jersey that didn't have his name on it, but it rather just said Wampum, his hometown. If you Google it, look up Dick Allen A's, you'll see the jersey that says Wampum. So he would end up retiring after that 1977 season, at the age of 35. And with that, let's move on from his biography and let's get into the statistics of Dick Allen's career. Now let's look at Dick Allen's counting stats. Dick Allen finished his career with 1,099 runs, 1,848 hits, 320 doubles, 79 triples, 351 home runs, 1,119 RBI, 133 stolen bases, a 292 batting average, a 378 on base percentage, a 534 slugging percentage, and 3,379 total bases. Now, at first glance, these traditional or counting stats don't necessarily jump off the page, and he doesn't hit the 2 big benchmarks for Hall of Fame induction that a lot of voters have looked at over the years, and that's hits and home runs. As I've mentioned before, 3,000 hits and no off-field issues was and still is a lock for the Hall of Fame. I've said it before, I'll say it again. If you have 3,000 hits and no PED issues or other sort of stuff keeping you out, that's like a lock for the Hall of Fame. Likewise, for years, 500 plus home runs was always seen as a Hall of Fame benchmark. Although, the recent home run extravaganza, as I like to say, kind of diminished the impact of 500 home runs. You had a lot of guys hitting, more than 500 home runs that had a little assistance. And so the single season and career home run records kind of got, deflated a little bit, but still 500 is a very good benchmark and kind of a traditional Hall of Fame benchmark for sluggers. Hey, did they get 500 home runs? So I think it was really, this lack of hitting these major milestones that kept Allen out of the Hall of Fame initially. But luckily now we have both traditional as well as some advanced statistics to look at. And it gives us a chance to sort of look at Allen's Hall of Fame case in a new light. Another thing we have now is Baseball Reference. When I grew up, I was always a baseball fan. I had encyclopedias and little books, and you kind of had to memorize stats. And as soon as someone like broke a record, you had to go buy a new book. But nowadays, we have nice things, and it's the future, and we have Baseball Reference. It's a great website where, in real time they update it, and you can go online and look at single season, career season. There's all kinds of statistical, fun you can have, and you can really get into the weeds here of looking into players' career and statistics, and that's what I've done here. And what I'm going to do before I get into the advanced statistics, I think one of the knocks is people just assume, Dick Allen doesn't have the career counting stats. Let's immediately go to the advanced statistics. Not so fast. I'm here to say I'm going to start by making the case for Allen based just on his counting stats alone. Even though he doesn't kind of hit some of the individual numbers that you would look at for being kind of hall-worthy, when you look at some of the milestones he has hit and you put them together, as I'm about to do, we'll see, I think it makes a very compelling Hall of Fame case for Dick Allen based only on these counting stats. Allow me to explain. The big counting stat that jumps out for me is 351 home runs. It's 99th all time. It doesn't get him in the Hall of Fame based on that stat alone, but I don't think the number should be scoffed at, as there's a lot of Hall of Fame players with at least, or players with at least a decent Hall of Fame discussion that are in this 350 to 450 home run range that falls below the traditional standard of 500. So just because you don't hit 500 doesn't mean you're not going to make the Hall of Fame. Now, I said this, Dick has more career home runs than Dave Parker, who I did an episode for, who I think belongs in the Hall of Fame, and I think he's getting in this year. Allen's career home run total is also higher than Ron Santo. Ron Santo had 342 home runs. I mentioned this. This is a good comparison case. Santo and Allen's careers are very similar. They both played 15 years and almost the same 15-year period. Santo played 1960 through 74, and Allen played 1963 through 77. So the careers overlapped. And Santo played most of his career with the Chicago Cubs before playing his last season with the White Sox. And Allen, of course, spent 3 years in the White Sox. And the two of them, they were actually teammates in the 1974 season, which was Santo's last season. So if you compare Ron Santo and Dick Allen head-to-head, it's very close. I'll put these comparisons on my Twitter X account for you to look at. But Santo has more hits and RBI, but Allen has more home runs, and he leads in all the statistical categories: batting average, on-base percentage, slugging, OPS, OPS plus. Although, interestingly, Santo leads in WAR. Now, I'm not saying these guys are identical players. I'm just saying that 300-plus home runs can still get you in the Hall of Fame as long as you've got some other stats or other arguments to sort of back you up. And in Santo's case, he had a very high career WAR and reputation as a good fielding third baseman. He won 5 Gold Gloves. Another kind of comparison player, Allen has more career home runs than Hall of Famer Scott Rowland. And if you compare them head-to-head, Scott just edges out Dick Allen in career hits, but by not much more. And Rowland, he had 2,077 hits, and Rowland has 168 more RBI than Allen. But Allen has more home runs, stolen bases, and again, better statistical averages across the board. And these guys both played third base, but Rowland's Hall of Fame case was no doubt helped by his Gold Gloves at the hot corner, and he won eight of those and retired with a great 70.1 wins above replacement. So I don't want to get too far into the weeds here comparing Allen to more players or, to Santo and Scott Rowland. Other than just say, I mentioned these two guys to say, hey, look, 300-plus home runs can still get you in the Hall of Fame. We just have to sort of look at some of the other statistics. So bear with me here. Follow me. Again, I think I can make the case for Dick Allen based on these counting stats. Now, in addition to the 350 home runs, Allen also has over 1,000 career runs and over 1,000 career RBI. Now, in all of baseball history, there are only 90 players with 350-plus home runs, 1,000 RBI, and 1,000 runs. Okay, 90 is pretty elite, all right? But does that get him in the Hall of Fame? Can we narrow this down to even more elite company based strictly on the counting stats? Yes, we can. Let's look at players with 350-plus home runs, 1,000 RBI, or 1,000 or more RBI, 1,000-plus runs, and 100-plus stolen bases. Only 42 players in Major League Baseball have reached all of those milestones. Now, I'm going to get a little more crazy here. What if we look at players with 350 or more home runs, 1,000 or more RBI, 1,000 or more runs, 100 or more stolen bases, and 75 or more triples. Well, now we're getting somewhere. There's only 10 players in baseball history with 350 or more home runs, 1,000 or more RBI, 1,000 or more runs, 100 or more stolen bases, and 75 or more triples. Those 10 players are Barry Bonds, Hank Aaron, Babe Ruth, Willie Mays, Lou Gehrig, Dave Winfield, Andre Dawson, Carlos Beltran, Al Kaline, and Dick Allen. Now, this counting stat list is where Allen's Hall of Fame argument really starts to get interesting. Of course, all those guys I mentioned except for Bonds and Beltran are in the Hall of Fame, and I made the case for Beltran previously. I think he's going to get in, which only leaves Bonds, who's out, for other reasons. He'll probably eventually get in. He's certainly one of the best players of all time. There's no denying that. So I just present this list to show that, based on counting stats alone, without taking into account any advanced statistics or sabermetrics, or even as averages, which we'll get into in a second, I think a compelling Hall of Fame case can be made for Dick Allen just based upon his counting stats, despite him not hitting the two big traditional milestones of 3,000 hits and 500 home runs. By demonstrating that he hit a combination of major league counting stat milestones shared by 9 other players in baseball history. And not just 9 players, but 9 greats of the game, 4 of whom I think have a compelling claim to being the greatest player of all time. That's, of course, Bonds, Aaron, Ruth, and Mays. So now, these lists I made are based on counting stats alone. Now, what if we factor in his career slash lines? Allen had a very good career batting average of .292, very good on-base percentage of .378, and a very good career slugging percentage of .534. Let's go back to those counting stats a bit and show them in conjunction with his career slash line numbers. Where does that leave him? Let's start with the 350 home runs and a career batting average of .290 or higher. There's only 39 players on this list, all of whom are in the Hall of Fame except for several active or recently retired players who certainly, or probably will be in the Hall of Fame. That's Trout, Votto, Cabrera, and Pujols, along with some of the PED guys, Bonds, Manny, Sheffield, Juan Gonzalez, Ryan Braun, and A-Rod. So the only players in this list not in the Hall of Fame and not associated with PEDs, to my knowledge, are Allen, Ellis Burks, Albert Bell, Jeff Kent, and Lance Berkman. Now, for the record, Bell, Kent, and Berkman all have compelling Hall of Fame cases, but, admittedly are borderline candidates. So can we tweak this list a little bit more to get a little more exclusive? Yes, we can. Let's look at players with 350 or more career home runs, a .290 or more career batting average, and a .375 or more career on-base percentage. That list gets narrowed down to only 29 players. And if we include the additional qualifier of a career slugging percentage of .530 or higher, there's only 24 players, all of whom are in the Hall of Fame except for Allen, Bonds, A-Rod, Manny, Trout, and Lance Berkman. So, wow, I'm kind of making the case for Lance Berkman here, too, although it's not a Lance Berkman episode. But, Berkman was never voted Rookie of the Year or MVP like Dick Allen did. So, if you want to get really exclusive with this list, let's also look at Dick Allen's OPS, which is on-base percentage plus slugging. It's an advanced statistic of sorts, and it's a good segue into sabermetric analysis of Allen's career. Allen's career OPS is .912, and his OPS plus is .156. If we narrow this list of players down, players with 350 or more career home runs, a .290 or higher batting average, a .375 or more career on-base percentage, and a career OPS plus of .155 or higher, it's only 14 players. It's Bonds, Ruth, Mays, Mantle, Jimmy Fox, Frank Thomas, Ted Williams, Mel Ott, Lou Gehrig, Stan Musial, Mike Trout, Joe DiMaggio, Johnny Mize, and Dick Allen. So he's in some pretty exclusive company. But if we really want to get crazy and narrow this list down even further, let's look at players with 350 or more career home runs, a .290 or higher batting average, a .375 or higher on-base percentage, a career OPS plus of .155 or higher, 75 or more career triples, and 100 plus stolen bases. It's just Bonds, Ruth, Mays, Gehrig, and Allen. That's it. Now, if we want to get really super crazy and narrow it down to players with 130 or more career stolen bases, just Barry Bonds, Willie Mays, and Dick Allen. That's it. So whether we're compiling and comping, straight counting stats or a combination of key counting stats and statistical average, I think the numbers don't lie. I think Dick Allen's counting stats, while at first glance, he doesn't hit some of these key milestones for each stat individually, when taken together, they put him in absolutely elite company, and in conjunction with his averages, place him in the upper stratosphere of baseball elites. So I think that based on his counting stats and his averages alone, Dick Allen belongs in the Hall of Fame. Now, what about his advanced statistics or sabermetrics? His career WAR, or wins above replacement, was 58.7, so it's a little short of that 70 to 75 sweet spot I always talk about. But in his defense, he moved positions a lot. And as I mentioned, he was put at third base his rookie season, despite not having played the position before, and ultimately led the league in errors that year at third base. So Allen's case is certainly one where you have to look beyond the numbers to understand where his WAR score comes from. But even with the defensive and positional, sort of dings to his score, it's still a very good career WAR, and it's higher than several Hall of Famers, including Willie Stargell, David Ortiz, Joe Mauer, Orlando Cepeda, and Jim Rice. Another advanced statistic we've talked about before here is adjusted OPS plus, which is OPS. OPS is slugging plus on-base percentage, but OPS plus is OPS adjusted for ballpark factors. In Allen's case, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that for most of Allen's career, he played with the Phillies at Shibe Park, later known as Connie Mack Stadium, which was just massive. If you're unaware, when Allen played there, I want to read off the dimensions. Center field was 447 feet. Deep left center was 420 feet, and deep right center was 405 feet. So this was a massive stadium. And for that reason, when you look at some of his career home runs and some of his individual season home run totals, you think, okay, they're good, they don't necessarily stand out. He played in a massive stadium. And for that reason, a lot of players, including Goose Goosage, who we're going to get into this in a minute, have said that, if Allen played in a smaller ballpark, he'd just have way more home runs than he did. And the stats back this up, as Allen is 25th all-time in adjusted OPS plus, just behind Shohei Ohtani at 24. Number one all-time, not surprisingly, is Babe Ruth. So this advanced statistic for me really helps Allen's Hall of Fame case. Another advanced statistic is adjusted batting runs. Allen's 57th all-time, just behind Hall of Famer Wade Boggs, but ahead of Hall of Famers Sam Crawford, Vlad Guerrero, Eddie Murray, Billy Hamilton, Todd Helton, Hank Greenberg, Fred McGriff, Larry Walker, Dave Winfield, the great Tony Gwynn, Mike Piazza, and of course Rod Carew. So very similar, Allen is 51st all-time in adjusted batting wins, ahead of a lot of Hall of Famers. And he's 37th all-time in offensive win percentage. He's also 50th all-time in wins probability added. Finally, I don't get into the weeds of advanced statistics, but I'll just say in my last episode, we talked about, Felix Hernandez, and there's some specific numbers which Baseball Reference, great website, calculates to determine whether or not a player can, is Hall-worthy, so to speak. One of them is a black ink score. Dick Allen's black ink score is 27, which is the exact average for a Hall of Famer, according to Baseball Reference. His Hall of Fame monitor score is 99, with Baseball Reference considering a score of 100 or more to mean a likely Hall of Famer. So he sits in very good company in these advanced statistics, and in many of those lists, he sits ahead of Hall of Famers. So in that respect, I think Allen is someone whose career has really been helped with the advanced statistic revolution, particularly the emphasis on OPS and OPS plus, which really favors induction for Allen, along with, as I've shown, I think some very elite counting stat categories that he was a part of. Now, in terms of hardware, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, just other than to say Dick Allen, he was a 7-time All-Star, probably should have been 8. He didn't get elected his Rookie of the Year season in 1964. I do want to mention one thing, though. I found this very interesting. Dick Allen won both the Rookie of the Year and the MVP award. I did some digging, and this is kind of a rabbit hole here, but if you look at players in Major League Baseball that have won both the Rookie of the Year and the MVP award, it's a pretty elite list. I'm going to read off some of the names here, starting with the first one. Jackie Robinson, Don Newcomb, Willie Mays, Frank Robinson, Orlando Cepeda, Willie McCovey, Pete Rose, Dick Allen, Rod Carew, Johnny Bench, Thurman Munson, Fred Lynn, Andre Dawson, Cal Ripken Jr., Jose Canseco, Jeff Bagwell, Ichiro Suzuki, Albert Pujols, Ryan Howard, Justin Verlander, Dustin Pedroia, Ryan Braun, Buster Posey, Mike Trout, Bryce Harper, Chris Bryant, Cody Bellinger, and the great Shohei Ohtani. That's a pretty short list. And look, if you know anything about baseball, I know it gets tedious. I read off these names. I like to read these lists of names off kind of for dramatic effect. I mean, these are some of the greatest players of modern baseball history. Most of those players I read off are either in the Hall of Fame or going to be in the Hall of Fame. Or if they're not in the Hall of Fame and they're qualified, it's either because of PEDs or, maybe their career just sort of cut off. There's some great players. We'll talk about Pedroia. He's on the ballot for this year. But, I'm looking at like Ryan Howard, Fred Lynn. They're not in the Hall of Fame. These are great players. No slouches. Don Newcomb's not in the Hall of Fame. Very good pitcher. He's got a good Hall of Fame case. But, that places Dick Allen in some pretty elite company. I know that, awards can be subjective, but still, the fact that he was both a Rookie of the Year and the MVP puts him in kind of an elite category. So I mentioned this all to say, if hardware is kind of your thing, different voters focus on different things. I have my sort of three-part analysis, but some people look at just all-star votes or just, MVPs, Rookie of the Year. So if that's kind of your thing and you're trying to say, hey, where does Dick Allen stand with the all-time greats in terms of, his hardware? I just read off a list of some of the best players in baseball history, and Dick Allen, is among those who have won both a Rookie of the Year and an MVP award. Finally, as you know, I love to talk about the fame factor. I like to go into the mystic, kind of adds a little bit of fun and some poetry and mysticism to this whole process. The statistics are really kind of the bulk of a Hall of Fame case, but, it's not just all about numbers. You got to look at sort of the fame factor and what did this person bring to the game and how is this person remembered? And Dick Allen's certainly one of those players that I think the fame factor really helps his Hall of Fame case. First and foremost, he's a player for whom many other former players and teammates have consistently supported, his Hall of Fame induction. One of the best known examples is Goose Goosage, himself a Hall of Fame pitcher. There's a great podcast. I'm not the only person that does podcasts about this stuff. And look, I do this for fun, and so I don't mind mentioning the other podcasts. There's a great podcast called the White Sox Podcast with Chuck Garfian. And on it, Hall of Fame pitcher Goose Goosage called Allen, quote, the best instinctive base runner he'd ever seen, even better than Rickey Henderson, saying that Allen's technique was incredible. It's just a great interview. If you like baseball podcasts, go give it a listen. Gossage talks about Allen. One of the things I found fascinating, he talks about how Dick Allen would intentionally strike out sometimes. If you look at Dick Allen's career counting stats, I mentioned before he led the league in strikeouts. He did that, I think, a few seasons. He had a pretty high strikeout total. But Goose Gossage explains this. He says that Dick Allen sometimes would intentionally strike out in the first few at-bats of a game just to try to figure out a pitcher's style and their pitch. And then he'd come up in that last, one or two at-bats of the game once he'd figured out the pitcher, and he would just unload on the pitcher. So it's a great story. Goose Gossage tells it way better than I do. But it's also something I've heard in interviews with Greg Maddux. There's a great interview with Greg Maddux. He talks about pitching to, I believe it was Jeff Bagwell. It was a regular season game. They had a lead or something, kind of an at-bat that didn't matter. He threw Bagwell some pitches just to see how he would react. And I believe Jeff Bagwell either hit a home run or a double. But Maddux got the intel he needed. And later that season, they faced each other in the playoffs, and he got Jeff Bagwell. So Dick Allen was very smart. He'd do things like that just to sort of see, hey, he would try to see their cards, so to speak. He wanted to see the pitcher's cards. He's like, okay, now I see what you're coming at me with a go-to pitch. Now I know how to beat you. Goose Gossage talks about this. So, if he was someone that was worried about the stats or advanced statistics, he said, I'm trying to walk, I shouldn't strike out. No, he didn't really care if he struck out because he knew he would come back and get you because he wanted to win. It was just one of those things we talked about in some of the other episodes. The game was played a little bit differently. I thought that was a fascinating comment by Goose Gossage, and great story there. In the same interview, Gossage, I got to mention this, he called Allen the greatest hitter he'd ever seen. And he's repeated this in other interviews, including a 2014 article in USA Today, where Gossage called Allen, quote, the greatest player I've ever seen play in my life. He had the most amazing season, 1972, I've ever seen. He's the smartest baseball man I've ever been around in my life. I mean, this is a glowing endorsement from a fellow Hall of Famer. In that same article, the 2014 USA Today article, Allen described himself as, quote, the modern-day Jackie Robinson, explaining that everything he went through, meaning Jackie, I went through, only I did it in modern times. And again, there's so much to get into in that story. I recommend reading the books, watching that documentary. For purposes of today, so look, Dick Allen had to deal with a lot of adversity in his career. And despite that adversity, he had an excellent career. We mentioned the statistics. I think that places him in Hall of Fame contention. Another great article is a 2019 article in the Wall Street Journal by Alan Barra called Dick Allen, quote, the best player eligible for the Hall of Fame. Another Hall of Famer, hopefully fellow, Dick Allen gets in, Hall of Famer Willie Stargell once called Allen, quote, ahead of his time, and addressing many of these adversities that Allen faced, said that if Willie were managing Dick Allen, he'd find a way to make Allen comfortable because, quote, when Dick Allen was comfortable, balls left the park. We saw that in my biography, as we talked about. Another former teammate and Hall of Famer, Mike Schmidt, also has a lot of great quotes about Dick Allen. Called him a great teammate and credits Allen with some great advice early in his career that helped him become the slugger he was. Finally, I can't discuss the fame factor of Dick Allen without discussing one of the most famous photographs of the 1970s, or even, of all time for baseball. And that, of course, is the photograph that graced the cover of the June 12th, 1972 edition of Sports Illustrated. If you haven't seen it, look it up. It's an outstanding photograph. It's fun. It's also kind of quirky, but also has sort of a dark undercurrent to it, and it's iconic for several reasons. First, as a brief aside, it shows Allen wearing the red-colored White Sox uniforms, which they wore for a few years in the 70s, which, in my opinion, I've talked about this on Twitter X, I think those are one of the greatest, if not the greatest, uniforms of baseball history. I absolutely love the White Sox uniform with the red. Both the home red, which is the one that Dick Allen's wearing in that photo with the pinstripes, also their road uniforms. It's kind of a powder blue with that red. Those two uniforms, oh my gosh, with the stirrups, just, outstanding uniforms. But the photo is famous and kind of quirky, but also with sort of a darker undercurrent because it shows Allen wearing his batting helmet in the dugout. As we mentioned before, there's a reason he wore that batting helmet, and it was because people threw stuff at him. So if you didn't know that story, there's kind of, a dark understory to it. But facially, at least superficially, it's sort of a lighthearted photo because, I'll get to the point here. In the photo, he's juggling baseballs in the dugout while smoking a cigarette. And that's kind of a time I want to talk about. I grew up in the 80s, in my parents' generation and their parents' generation, World War II generation. We basically don't have smoking in the public sphere anymore. But when I was growing up, it still was there. I remember from the McDonald's in my town, you go into, there was a smoking section, non-smoking section. And obviously, look, if you're listening here, if the kids are listening, smoking is terrible for your health. But there was a time in America where everyone smoked and you could smoke in public. I remember going to Atlanta Fulton County Stadium to watch the Braves as a kid. You could smoke in the seats. And I remember, I want to say it was like 88, 89. I remember when it happened, it was all over the news. They said, you can't smoke in the seats anymore. You have to stand on the outside. There's a little yellow line. If baseball fans remember this. You had to stand there and smoke. And everyone was really upset. Oh my gosh, I have to get up from my seat and go smoke. Nowadays, I'm pretty sure you probably can't smoke in any of the stadiums. If you go smoke in a baseball stadium, they'll probably get the cops to throw you out. So smoking used to be a lot more prevalent. Anyway, I don't get off on it. So in the picture, it's just kind of a funny, quirky picture and kind of a good microcosm of the 70s. The 70s is sort of a wild decade. So here he is in this very colorful uniform. A lot of the 70s uniforms are very colorful because color TV was brand new. So there he is, and he's got this great uniform. He's smoking a cigarette. He's juggling baseballs. So in terms of fame factor, you may not even know who Dick Allen is or may not know much about baseball, but you may have seen that picture before and just thought it was a great picture. And look, I'm not going to say a player deserves to get in the Hall of Fame based on a picture. There's a lot of great and iconic photos of players who don't have a good Hall of Fame case, but it's just an interesting story that makes the case for Dick Allen. Sometimes an iconic baseball photo, just has a cultural impact that extends beyond, the baseball nerddom of fans such as myself. Another example I'd point out, we're not talking about it here, he's already in the Hall of Fame, but George Brett, there's a famous photo in National Geographic who's signing autographs with his jersey on that says Royals. And if you know the story, but if you don't, the song Royals by Lorde, I will never be Royals, that song. It was written because she had no idea who, I think she's from either New Zealand or Australia. She saw that in the magazine, no idea who George Brett was, didn't know anything about baseball, saw the picture, thought it was a cool picture, wrote the song from it. So I mentioned all this to say, there are people out there who've probably seen that picture of Dick Allen smoking his cigarette and juggling baseballs in the dugout. Probably don't even know who Dick Allen is, don't know anything about baseball, the White Sox, but they know that picture. And so little things like that, look, we're sort of a tight-knit community, the baseball nerd community, but it's great to have things like that out there somewhere because they add sort of an interesting component to baseball history, and they bring in fans. They might see that and say, wow, that looks fun. What sport is that? Oh, it's baseball. Tell me about it. Sure, let's watch a game. Next thing you know, they're a fan for life. So, stuff like that is really interesting. So I think the fame factor certainly helps Dick Allen. And in closing, too, I mentioned it several times. I read some books. The story of Dick Allen is very compelling. He compared himself to Jackie Robinson. I'll just, I'd be remiss if I didn't say it again. He dealt with a lot of adversity in his career, which is very unfortunate. There's some really sad aspects of the Dick Allen story in terms of the adversity he faced. But Dick Allen was such a good player. He overcame that adversity. He had an outstanding career. And I think based upon the stats, the hardware, and the fame factor, I think Dick Allen is a very, very deserving Hall of Famer. I think he belongs in the Hall of Fame. I think it's long overdue for Dick Allen to get into the Hall of Fame, and I hope that he gets into the Hall of Fame. And I look forward to seeing Dick Allen in the Hall of Fame. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please check out my other episodes and stay tuned for my next episode where we're going to discuss Tommy John. Not the surgery, but the pitcher. Yes, the pitcher. He's someone, just spoiler alert here, we're going to get into it a little bit. I think if there's anyone, I think I've said this before, if there's anyone that the fame factor may be the biggest component of the Hall of Fame case, I think it's Tommy John and Roger Maris. Tommy John in particular, man, we're gonna talk about Tommy John. It's gonna be fascinating. I can't wait to do it. And Tommy John's coming up on the ballot this year, so I can't wait to get into Tommy John. But until then, look, remember, when life gets you down, stop what you're doing and watch a baseball game.